A white professor slams his marker down, sneers at the silent room, and erases a black 12-year-old's math solution in front of a crowd of college seniors. "This is child's play," he says. Cameras are rolling. Elijah stands frozen, humiliated, his voice caught between genius and disbelief. But what no one sees is the paper in his back pocket, the one that might change math forever. And he's about to pull it out. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun glazed over the polished brick exterior of Fairview Academy, casting golden streaks across the ivy-covered walls. Inside, the scent of fresh chalk and old money lingered in the halls like a ghost that refused to leave. Fairview wasn't just a school, it was an institution, a breeding ground for legacy admissions, where names mattered more than minds. Its classrooms were lined with portraits of pale-faced alumni and oil paintings of benefactors, whose donations kept the school exclusive. It was a place where brilliance was expected only from the expected. And today, brilliance was being tested, but only from those deemed worthy. Room 304 buzzed with anticipation. Seniors in perfectly tailored uniforms, many children of corporate CEOs and senators, sat upright in their mahogany desks, notebooks opened, not out of eagerness, but obligation. At the center of the room stood Dr. Claude Hemsworth, a man whose presence silenced chatter the moment he walked in. With a silver beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice that curled at the edges like old parchment, he was Fairview's gatekeeper of mathematics, feared, respected, and never questioned. He tapped the whiteboard twice, his marker squeaking as he drew a long, complex equation that twisted across the board like a serpent. It wasn't part of the curriculum. It wasn't even from the school's own archives. It was something more ambitious, something meant to be unreachable. "This," he announced, stepping back from the board, "is the unsolvable." Students leaned forward, not to understand, but to witness the spectacle. They had seen this act before. Dr. Hemsworth loved performances, especially ones that ended with him humiliating anyone who dared to think outside his rigid logic. He turned slowly, letting the suspense build. "This equation," he continued, "has stumped minds far superior to yours. Mathematicians from Princeton, MIT, even Cambridge, have failed to complete its final proof." He paused, smirking. "I want you to try. I dare you. But understand this. No child, no hobbyist, no fluke prodigy from a science fair will ever touch this." The room chuckled in unison. The laughter wasn't cruel, it was conditioned. These were students trained to believe they were at the top of the food chain. Hemsworth's next sentence cut the air like a blade. "Certainly not a middle schooler." The words echoed beyond the classroom walls, slipping through the hallway like poison on the wind. Just outside, unseen by the students but not unnoticed by the universe, stood Elijah Reed, his backpack slung low, sneakers untied. He peered through the narrow window in the hallway, his face half lit by the fluorescent glare. He was 12, young enough to be dismissed by age alone. But his eyes didn't blink. Elijah had been coming to Fairview twice a week, as part of the school's so-called outreach initiative, a program designed to satisfy district diversity quotas, without really changing anything. The kids in that program didn't sit in the real classes. They stayed in a basement-level room, with older textbooks, and substitute teachers who rarely stayed past their second week. But Elijah had a habit of wandering, not because he was disobedient, but because he was curious. Math wasn't a subject to him. It was language, logic, music, and what he saw on that board made his fingers twitch. Behind him, the bell rang, but he didn't move. Inside, the seniors scribbled nonsense on their papers, pretending to engage. Elijah's gaze was fixed. He raised his notebook and slowly, meticulously, began copying the equation, not line for line, but step by step, understanding its rhythm like a symphony he'd heard before. He'd never seen this exact expression, but something in it sang to him. It wasn't arrogance or delusion. It was clarity, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. He sat on the cold floor, away from the hallway's surveillance cameras, his knees curled up to serve as a desk. His pencil flew across the page, not in frantic scrawls, but in smooth, calculated movements. Line 1, then line 2. His brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in focus. He had solved harder problems alone at the public library, without anyone watching or believing. The difference now was that someone might see. Inside room 304, Dr. Hemsworth paced slowly between desks, glancing at half-finished answers with disdain. Wrong. Lazy. Close but lazy, he murmured. He stopped at one student's paper and scoffed audibly. If you think this is right, then clearly the academy is lowering its standards. Outside, Elijah paused for a moment. He heard the words, felt them, not directed at him, yet still about him, about all kids like him. Kids who were only accepted in the margins, never the center, who were welcome in yearbook photos but not valedictorian lists. Back in the classroom, a student raised his hand hesitantly. Sir, what would it mean if someone did solve it? Hemsworth turned, his voice soaked in disdain. It would mean that person, whoever they are, was a fluke, an accident. It wouldn't make them a mathematician. It would make them lucky. And we don't reward luck here. We reward legacy. His words landed like verdicts. Outside, Elijah gripped his pencil tighter. He didn't need a reward. He didn't need applause. But he needed to prove, if not to them, then to himself, that genius wasn't defined by skin, school, or surname. The hallway lights flickered briefly, unnoticed by most, but Elijah remained still, like a statue locked in thought. And then, with a breath so steady it could have been a whisper, he wrote the next line. The numbers aligned. Variables danced into place. He was solving it. A janitor passed by, glancing curiously at the boy sitting on the floor, scribbling with intensity. You okay, kid? Elijah didn't answer, not because he didn't hear, but because he couldn't stop. The equation was opening up, the pieces fitting, falling into place, not with noise but with quiet revelation. Every mark was intentional, every pause precise. Inside the classroom, Hemsworth announced, class dismissed. Students packed up lazily, unaware of the history being written just outside their door. Elijah didn't move. He finished the final line, looked over the entire sequence, and blinked. His heart didn't race. It slowed, because he knew. He didn't just understand the answer. He understood the problem. And in that moment, something cracked open inside him. A realization, a power. But just as he closed the notebook, footsteps approached from behind. A shadow falls over Elijah's notebook. Dr. Hemsworth is standing above him. The echo of footsteps and whispers traveled faster than truth inside Fairview Academy. By the time the lunch bell rang that day, nearly every senior in the math department had heard the rumor some 12-year-old from the outreach basement had solved Hemsworth's equation. At first it was dismissed. A joke. Another urban myth to lighten the weight of pre-college anxiety. But then the rumor took form. A name. A face. Elijah Reed. A black kid. From the other side of campus. And the laughter turned to discomfort. Inside the staff lounge, where the coffee was bitter and conversation sharper, tension brewed like the day's third pot of espresso. A group of senior faculty, mostly white, tenure-insulated men, gathered near the window. Hemsworth stood at the center, his arms folded, jaw clenched not in anger but in calculation. He's what? 12? Asked Dr. Myers, a chemistry instructor. From the grant program? The outreach initiative, corrected Principal Barrington, trying to mask his disdain. They bust them in twice a week. It's meant to build inclusivity. Right, another muttered. Diversity optics. Hemsworth didn't look up from the printout he held. Elijah's scribbled notebook pages had been scanned and distributed like contraband. It wasn't just that the kid got close. It was the elegance of it. The sheer intuition. Even if it's right, said Barrington, lowering his voice, we can't parade him. What message does that send? That a middle schooler can outperform our seniors? That we need charity programs to find genius? Dr. Hemsworth finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. It sends the wrong message to our students, our donors, our legacy families. And we don't need that kind of disruption. Outside the glass-paneled math wing, Elijah waited, clutching the same weathered notebook. He didn't wear the uniform. His jacket was too thin for the building's frigid air, yet his stance was upright, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't seeking approval. He was ready for a challenge, one he hadn't asked for, but one he'd already entered simply by being seen. Earlier that morning, he had been called to Principal Barrington's office, not to be disciplined, as he feared, but to be invited to present his solution to a select audience of staff and students. The tone was tight-lipped and condescending, framed as a rare educational opportunity, but the unspoken message was clear: we're watching you now. Meanwhile, Monique Reed sat in the back row of a crowded public bus, her second shift still hours away. She clutched her phone, refreshing her email inbox every few minutes. Nothing from Fairview. No explanation. No permission slip. Just silence. She had spent months fighting to get Elijah access to proper math materials. She had called the district, attended board meetings where she wasn't acknowledged, begged for transportation support, and now her son was on the verge of proving what she always knew. His brilliance wasn't a fluke, it was fire. But systems didn't reward fire. They feared it. When Elijah stepped into the lecture hall, the silence was heavy, not with reverence, but resistance. Rows of students sat with crossed arms and smirking lips. Behind them, teachers leaned against walls like judges waiting for an execution. Elijah didn't flinch. He walked up to the whiteboard, where Dr. Hemsworth already stood, marker in hand. "This," Hemsworth said, gesturing to the board, "is your chance to walk us through your interpretation." He emphasized the last word as if Elijah's solution were fan fiction, not mathematics. Elijah nodded once. His voice was quiet but clear. "I didn't interpret it. I solved it. Or, at least I think I did." A few chuckles echoed through the room. One student whispered, "This should be cute." Another muttered, "Hope he brought crayons." Elijah ignored them. He uncapped the marker and began drawing the first line from memory, explaining his logic with each step. There was no stumbling, no hesitation. His mind ran like a precision engine. Each phrase was laced with insight, not memorized terms, but real understanding. The room slowly shifted. A few students leaned forward. Others exchanged glances, their smirks beginning to fade. But not Hemsworth. He watched like a predator waiting for a mistake. When Elijah completed the first line, he stepped aside. "From here I isolated the imaginary coefficients." Before he could finish, Hemsworth grabbed the eraser and wiped the entire line clean. "Stop," he said coldly. Gasps rang out. Even the skeptical students looked stunned. "That," Hemsworth continued, "was mathematically juvenile." Elijah blinked. Once, twice. Not in confusion, but disbelief. His hand, still holding the marker, trembled slightly. "Sir." "With respect."
No.
Hemsworth cut in sharply. "Respect is earned. And this board isn't a playground. You've misunderstood fundamental properties of the expression." Elijah stepped back, his heart pounding. Not from embarrassment, but from rage quietly blooming inside. He had done nothing wrong. Nothing arrogant. He was told to present, and now he was being ridiculed. A teacher in the back, Mrs. Collins, spoke up cautiously. "I reviewed his notes. The logic is compelling. Perhaps we should—" "This isn't a charity show," said Dr. Myers from the wall. "Let's not conflate cleverness with scholarship." Elijah looked across the room. No one stood. No one defended. Even those who were intrigued by his approach now sank into their seats, unwilling to associate themselves with the outlier. A student raised her hand. Why invite him if we weren't going to hear him out? The question floated unanswered. Elijah looked at the board, at the empty space where his first line had been, a white void where his voice had tried to exist. He turned to Hemsworth and met his gaze. "I didn't come to be your example," Elijah said softly. "I came because I thought truth mattered more than permission." The silence was suffocating. Monique burst through the back door of the hall at that moment. Having left her job early and caught 2 buses just to get there, she locked eyes with her son and then turned to the front of the room, where an adult had just tried to erase a child's potential in real time. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Principal Barrington stood, trying to de-escalate. "Mrs. Reed, we appreciate Elijah's enthusiasm." Monique's voice was razor sharp. "That's not what I asked." No one responded. Elijah quietly returned the marker to its tray and picked up his notebook from the podium. He walked past rows of silence, his footsteps the only sound. But just before he reached the door, another voice, clear, feminine, and authoritative, broke the tension. "Wait." Everyone turned. From the side entrance, a woman entered, tall, poised, dressed in sharp navy. She wasn't part of the faculty. She held up a printed version of Elijah's notebook pages. "That first line you erased," she said, looking at Hemsworth. "It's not wrong. It's groundbreaking." The woman steps forward, introducing herself as Dr. Neen Walsh, an ex-Fairview graduate turned blacklisted mathematician, and she has a proposition for Elijah. The moment the marker hit the whiteboard, and Dr. Hemsworth erased Elijah's equation, a stunned silence blanketed the room. But not everyone stayed still. In the back row, tucked behind a laptop and a thermos of overpriced coffee, 17-year-old senior Audrey McMillan slid her phone from under her notebook and pressed record. Her fingers trembled, not from excitement, but discomfort. Audrey wasn't a rebel, nor was she particularly invested in school politics. But something about that moment, watching a grown man dismantle a black kid's dignity in front of a room full of silent witnesses, triggered something she didn't have a name for yet. So she recorded, and when she uploaded the clip 2 hours later, captioned "Professor humiliates 12-year-old genius. This ain't education." She never expected what would follow. By midnight, the clip had passed 40,000 views. By morning, it hit 2 million. The hashtags Elijah Reed and Jen Let Him Solve exploded across Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. Comment sections were filled with fury, heartbreak, and disbelief. People weren't just reacting to the racism. They were reacting to the cruelty, the blatant gatekeeping, the symbolism of erasing a child's work while standing next to a wall of white alumni portraits. News outlets moved quickly. CNN ran a segment titled, "Is Genius Only Welcome When It's White?" MSNBC followed with a panel on racial disparities in gifted programs. Even late-night hosts picked it up. Memes and edits flooded the internet, pairing Elijah's calm defiance with protest chants and scenes from civil rights films. Within 24 hours, Elijah Reed became a household name, a reluctant symbol of genius suppressed by a system designed to ignore brilliance that didn't fit its mold. But while the internet exploded in admiration, Fairview Academy locked down. The head office issued a vague public statement, referring to the incident as a misunderstood educational exercise, refusing to name Elijah at all. Behind closed doors, however, their response was swift and severe. Elijah was pulled from the outreach program indefinitely. The official reason: unforced attendance in restricted instructional spaces. Monique received a notice via email. No call, no discussion, just a cold, formal suspension from a space her son wasn't even fully part of to begin with. She didn't take it quietly. Wearing the same work clothes she had on during her night shift, Monique stormed into Fairview's administration building the next morning. Her voice echoed through the marble-floored hallways as she demanded a meeting with the school board. Not a secretary, not a liaison. The board, the real decision-makers hiding behind committees and committees designed to delay justice. In the lobby, students and staff tried not to look at her, yet couldn't look away. She wasn't screaming. She was precise, calm, righteous. You let a child be humiliated on camera, and your response is to punish him for existing, she said to a group of stunned assistants. Tell Dr. Ainsworth, I'm not leaving. Not until someone explains to me why your school is so afraid of my son's mind. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in his room, staring at the flood of notifications on his phone. His face had been plastered across screens worldwide. Yet inside his chest, he felt invisible. He didn't understand the fame. He hadn't asked for it. All he had done was see a pattern, solve a puzzle. Now he was a hashtag, a headline, a debate point on cable news. He scrolled through hundreds of DMs, messages from activists, mathematicians, college professors, offers to interview him, mentor him, praise him. But each ping made him feel further from what he loved. The pure, unfiltered joy of solving something no one else could. The math had been his sanctuary. Now it was a war zone. The door creaked open. Monique walked in, her exhaustion buried under determination. They've agreed to a meeting next week, she said, but they're calling it a closed review session. They're not going to let you speak.
Elijah looked up. Then what's the point?
She knelt beside him. Because sometimes the point isn't to convince them. It's to make sure they know you're not going anywhere. Her voice cracked, but her hands stayed steady. That night, after Monique fell asleep on the couch with her work shoes still on, Elijah opened his laptop, not to scroll, not to escape, but to return to the only place that still made sense: the equation. He recreated it from memory, refining it, twisting variables until they sang in harmony. He didn't do it for Fairview. He did it for himself, for his mother, for all the kids who would never be allowed near that board. It was past 2 a.m. when he noticed the email. No subject, no name, just a short message. I know what you solved. Meet me. Attached was a location, a bookstore, one he didn't recognize, in a quiet neighborhood across town. The sender's name, Dr. N. Walsh. He leaned back, the glow from the screen reflecting off his tired eyes. The name tugged at something. He searched it, half expecting spam. But what came up stunned him. Dr. Nadine Walsh, former math professor, tenured at 2 universities before being pushed out for controversial research. Blacklisted after a paper on algorithmic bias in academia was mysteriously withdrawn from every journal it had been submitted to. She had disappeared from the public eye over a decade ago, and now she was reaching out to him. Elijah clicks reply, but before he types a word, another message pops up, this time from an anonymous address. Don't trust her. Elijah didn't sleep. The anonymous email had done its job well. 5 simple words that unraveled everything. Don't trust her. He sat in the dim glow of his laptop. The screen split between 2 emails. On one side, Dr. Nadine Walsh's invitation, clear, direct, oddly calm. On the other, the faceless warning that planted a seed of suspicion. He tried tracing the anonymous address. Nothing. No domain. No signature. Just silence and shadow. His instincts told him one thing, but his curiosity pulled him another way. By dawn, with the sun peeling through his bedroom blinds, and his mother asleep on the couch after another graveyard shift, Elijah made his choice. He closed the laptop, slipped on his hoodie, and left with his notebook tucked under his arm like armor. The bookstore wasn't what he expected. Tucked between a laundromat and a long-abandoned deli, it felt more like a memory than a business. Its wooden sign hung crooked, and its windows were filmed with dust, but inside it breathed with quiet rebellion. Stacks of paperbacks leaned against each other like old friends, and the air smelled of pages that had been read too many times to count. At the back, beside a small round table with chipped edges, sat Dr. Nadine Walsh. She didn't rise with drama or offer a rehearsed greeting. Instead, she stood, extended a hand, and said, "You're earlier than I expected." Elijah only replied with a quiet, "I didn't sleep." She nodded. "Good. Neither did I." They sat across from each other like 2 versions of the same storm. One past, one just beginning. Nadine opened a leather folder and laid out pages from Elijah's now viral notebook, marked with red ink, and notes in the margins. It wasn't criticism, it was reverence. She tapped the first line. "This isn't just correct," she said. "It's revolutionary." Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I just followed the logic," he muttered. "No," she said firmly. "You saw the logic. That's not the same thing." When she told him what he had solved, a disguised variant of the Riemann hypothesis, his heart didn't race. It dropped. He knew the name, knew it from whispered legends in the math world, from articles and textbooks that treated it like holy ground. The Riemann hypothesis wasn't just a problem, it was the problem. A question older than his grandparents, one that still kept tenured professors awake at night. And he had cracked a variation of it before puberty. Nadine leaned forward, her voice lowering. "What you were given wasn't a clean version. It was muddled, corrupted, a deliberate misdirection. You weren't supposed to solve it." Her words hit like weights. "But you did." She paused, searching his eyes. "Do you know why that terrifies them?" Right. Elijah didn't speak. He just stared at the printouts. She continued. "Because I wrote a version of that equation 20 years ago." His head snapped up. "Yes," she confirmed. "It was mine. It looked different, simpler, but the skeleton was identical. I proposed a theory they weren't ready to hear, and they buried it. They called it unsound, unprovable. Within months, my name was scrubbed from citations. Journals pulled my submissions. My tenure was stripped." Her voice broke, but not with weakness, with fury restrained for years. Then 3 years ago, Claude Hemsworth published a challenge problem for his graduate seminar. It was my equation, with his name, no citations, and no one questioned it. Elijah's throat tightened. His chest felt too small for his lungs. "So, he stole it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Nadine nodded. "He buried it under noise, then dared others to find the melody he stole." She handed him another folder, one filled with emails, meeting transcripts, peer review rejections, and quiet whispers of academic betrayal, evidence. She had carried the burden of her erasure in paper form for decades, waiting for someone who could reignite the spark. "He won't let you win," she said. "They won't." A 12-year-old black boy solving a problem masked by one of their own? That's not a headline they can tolerate. That's a threat to the entire architecture of their credibility. Elijah stared down at the folder. It didn't feel like proof. It felt like prophecy. He saw himself in those old documents, in every marginal note, every redacted paragraph. They had done it before, and they would do it again. He looked up. "Why are you helping me?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a plea. "Because when they crushed me," she said, her eyes sharp, "I promised I'd make sure the next one survived." She leaned in, her tone grave. "They will try to erase you, because if they acknowledge your mind, they must admit their lies. Their system was never built for you to thrive." It was built for you to admire from the outside, quietly, gratefully. Silence hovered between them. Not awkward, not forced. Heavy, honest. Finally, Elijah asked the question he'd been avoiding. What do I do now? You decide, she said simply. But whatever path you choose, understand, you're not a student anymore. You're a threat. Act accordingly. She stood, collected her papers, and gave him a nod that wasn't goodbye. It was solidarity. Keep your notes safe, she added. They'll come for that before they come for you. Then she disappeared between the shelves, leaving Elijah alone with nothing but proof and the growing sense that his childhood had ended somewhere between lines of algebra. He sat still for minutes, maybe longer. The buzz of the old ceiling fan above him was the only sound. He opened the folder again, flipping to the last page. There, in neat cursive, was Nadine's original signature beside an equation eerily similar to his. Different variables, same heartbeat. Her math, his mind, one truth. He didn't feel powerful. He felt endangered. Just as he closed the folder and reached for his phone, it buzzed. A new email. No subject. No sender. Just a single file attachment. Project ER Confidential. With trembling hands, he tapped to open it. The document loaded slowly, page by page of cryptic language and departmental stamps, budget tables, names, dates. Then his stomach dropped. At the bottom of page 3, buried in the metadata, was a chilling discovery. His name, Elijah R. Reed, listed under target subject, dated 3 months before he had ever stepped foot in Dr. Hemsworth's classroom. Elijah rereads the document and realizes he wasn't just solving an equation, he was the experiment. The discovery inside the confidential document never left Elijah's mind. Even as he tried to breathe through the shock of seeing his own name cataloged as a subject of observation, the realization rooted itself deeper. Fairview had been watching him long before the world had. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't curiosity. It was surveillance disguised as mentorship. The next morning, when he walked onto campus, the halls no longer felt like an academic space. They felt like a laboratory corridor. People didn't look at him like a student now. They looked at him like a specimen that spoke too loudly. Conversations quieted whenever he passed. Eyes flickered away, and the same school that once tolerated his presence now behaved as if he had trespassed into territory that was never meant for him. By noon, the quiet purge began. His name vanished from the math club roster first. The digital sign-up sheets on the bulletin board displayed neat rows of legacy surnames, but the one space where Elijah Reed had once stood was now blank, as if he had never existed there. The official explanation arrived hours later in a sharp, formal email. Membership reevaluation based on eligibility compliance. Monique read it twice, her hands tightening around her phone. Eligibility, she muttered under her breath. They let you join when you were silent. Now that you're visible, suddenly you don't qualify. Inside the department office, the staff worked like a well-trained machine of avoidance. They spoke in measured tones, in memorized legal phrases, every sentence rehearsed and softened to avoid liability. But behind those calm responses was something colder, something territorial. Late in the afternoon, Principal Barrington called a faculty clarification meeting, and the atmosphere inside the conference room was suffocating. Suits, binders, clipped voices. Hemsworth sat at the head of the table, posture relaxed, expression composed in that smug kind of confidence that only comes from knowing the institution was built to protect men like him. He cleared his throat slowly, before speaking. Let us recenter the narrative, he said, folding his hands. The equation, and all variations derived from departmental instruction, remain the intellectual property of Fairview Academy. The boys' work, while enthusiastic, was generated within institutional parameters. Therefore, it belongs to the department. There was no outrage in the room.
No objection.
Just compliance. A junior faculty member hesitated, voice shaking as she spoke. But the methodology, the structure, it doesn't resemble your earlier drafts. It resembles his. Hemsworth smiled politely. The kind of smile that disguised hostility as professionalism. Students often believe they've contributed something original, he replied, but most of what they do is derivative. That's the nature of mentorship. We refine, reclaim. It's how academia works. Someone murmured, then why is the school distancing itself from him publicly? Hemsworth answered without blinking, because credibility requires restraint. And this situation has attracted the wrong kind of attention. Outside that room, the wrong kind of attention was already burning through social media, while inside Fairview, a quieter war brewed in hushed corners and closed-door corridors. Some teachers sent Elijah small acknowledgments in secret, a nod in the hallway, an email that read "Stay strong" with no signature. Others avoided him entirely, whispering that his case was exaggerated, sensationalized, over-dramatized. Some framed him as ungrateful, others called him reckless. The division wasn't loud, it was insidious, polite, professionally sanitized bigotry masquerading as academic disagreement. Monique refused to let the silence swallow him. She marched into the district office, documents stacked in her arms, her exhaustion burning into resolve. She filed a civil rights complaint, not as an act of rebellion, but as survival. The woman at the reception desk spoke in slow, practiced sympathy, promising the matter would be reviewed in sequence. Monique leaned in across the counter, voice steady yet trembling underneath. "My son doesn't have the luxury of waiting in sequence," she said. "He is being erased in real time." The filing stamped, the process began, and yet the system moved like molasses. That evening, an envelope arrived in the mail, embossed, gold-trimmed, beautifully deceptive. Inside was a scholarship offer from an elite private math institute, fully funded, prestige dripping, the kind of opportunity families dreamed of. But beneath the praise-filled introduction came the clause printed in neat, sterile language. Recipient agrees to refrain from discussing or publicly associating with prior academic disputes or institutional controversies, past or ongoing. Elijah stared at the page. Monique read it twice. Nadine read it once, and knew exactly what it was. "A golden cage," she said softly. "They want your silence, not your growth." For a moment, temptation weighed heavily in the room. The reality of bills, of instability, of dreams that could finally breathe. But the price wasn't tuition, it was disappearance. Elijah folded the letter slowly and set it aside. "If the only way they'll educate me is by erasing me," he said quietly, "then they aren't educating me at all." Monique's eyes filled, pride and fear locked in the same space. The next day, Fairview escalated. Legal language replaced conversation. Cold signatures replaced empathy. And the narrative shifted, strategically framing Elijah as disruptive, misguided, and misinformed about academic ownership. The whispers turned sharper. Students repeated headlines instead of truth. Faculty repeated policies instead of conscience. Even the counselors avoided eye contact in the hallway, as if advocacy itself had become a liability. Nadine warned them one evening over a dimly lit table in their kitchen, her tone stripped of reassurance. "They're tightening the perimeter. Every document, every server, every login, they're stabilizing their claim. Before you stabilize yours." Elijah listened quietly, absorbing every word without blinking. "What you're fighting now," she continued, "isn't arrogance anymore. It's infrastructure." He understood, and yet he refused to fold. Late that night, he returned to his room to retrieve his notebook, the one constant piece of proof that still felt alive, handwritten, tangible, unalterable. He opened his desk drawer. It was empty, not rearranged, not shuffled, gone. His breath halted in his chest, the silence ringing inside his ears. He rummaged through the drawer again, slower this time, as if the notebook might reveal itself if he moved gently enough. But instead of pages filled with equations, his fingers brushed against a single flat envelope, thick, cream-colored, heavy with intention. He slid it out and unfolded the letter inside. The words didn't shout, they suffocated. "Cease and desist. Notice of intellectual claim enforcement. All claims of authorship, distribution or academic ownership of mathematical material originating within Fairview Academy's instructional domain are hereby prohibited. Continued assertion of credit or public reference to the disputed solution constitutes breach of institutional property provision." At the bottom, bold, unwavering, confident, sat the signature, "Claude Hemsworth, Ph.D. The paper trembled in Elijah's hands, not because he was afraid, but because the letter wasn't just a threat. It was proof that they believed they owned his mind. Monique stepped into the doorway, reading his expression before she read the words. "What did they do now?" she whispered. Elijah handed her the letter silently. She didn't speak for several seconds. Her chest rose, then fell, as if absorbing the weight of a history that had repeated itself 1,000 times across different names and different children who dared to think beyond permitted boundaries. "They're trying to seal you shut," she said, her voice breaking. "They're trying to turn your brilliance into contraband." The room went impossibly still, and then his phone buzzed. A calendar notification slid across the screen. "Meeting with Fairview Legal Counsel. Attendance mandatory. No explanation. No option. No escape." The time was already set. Tomorrow morning. Elijah lifts his eyes from the screen and realizes the meeting location isn't on campus. It's inside the restricted faculty wing, where students were never meant to enter. It began with a simple login. Elijah sat hunched in the school's quiet computer lab, his fingers gliding across the keyboard, searching for his own name in the student server archives. The school had promised that all academic records, including club submissions, digital presentations, and solution files, would be accessible to students at any time. But when Elijah searched the document he had uploaded, the one that contained the solution to the modified Riemann hypothesis, it was gone, not moved, not renamed, deleted. Every folder that once bore his name in the math department's internal drive, now read, no data found. Confused at first, he double-checked the dates, filters, even alternate spellings. Nothing. He tried the backups next, hoping some cached version had survived. Still, the screen stared back at him with quiet denial. He stood abruptly, walking to the front desk of the computer lab, where a young IT aide sat, sipping coffee. "Excuse me," Elijah said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Can you check the server access logs? My files are missing." The aide barely looked up. "You sure you saved them under the school domain?" "I did. I even tagged it for departmental review. Last week." "Well," the aide replied with a shrug. "If it's not there, it probably never uploaded." Elijah clenched his jaw, recognizing the casual dismissal. He turned away without another word, heart pounding with quiet fury. As he left the lab, he passed a group of students whispering behind cupped hands. Some stared, others avoided eye contact. By now his name was synonymous with controversy, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because he'd done something too right. That afternoon, he returned home to find Monique pacing the living room, her face tense with confusion. "My phone's acting weird," she said. "It restarted by itself twice. My email logged out, and someone changed the password on my school board portal." Elijah felt a chill crawl across his skin. "It's not just your phone," he said. "My files are gone. Everything I submitted, gone like it never existed." He showed her his empty student dashboard, the locked folders, the missing equation. Monique stared at the screen, then at her son, the gravity of the moment sinking in. "They're cleaning up," she whispered. "They're erasing you." Before either could speak again, Nadine Walsh's voice rang through Elijah's cracked phone speaker. She was calling over encrypted audio. Her tone was clipped and urgent. "You have to move fast. If they're already purging files, they're one step ahead. That means they've initiated the containment protocol." "What protocol?" Monique asked, confused. "It's how academic institutions protect proprietary claims. Once they label something as department-owned, they begin scrubbing external associations. They're rewriting history. Digitally, legally, quietly." "Can we stop it?" Elijah asked. "Only if we find proof. Original copies. Something they haven't touched yet." Monique turned to her son. "Did you ever email yourself the solution?" "I saved it to a flash drive, but I left it in the math lab." Nadine was silent for a second. "Then we hope they missed it." They didn't. By the time Elijah rushed to the lab the next morning, the drawer where he kept the flash drive was empty. Not picked over, cleaned, sterilized. Even the maintenance sticker on the computer tower had been replaced with a newer label, backdated by 2 weeks. It was as if he had never worked there, never sat at that desk, never solved the equation. But fate has a way of leaving breadcrumbs. Back in the corner of the math department's internal website, buried under an archived staff portal, Elijah stumbled onto something unexpected. It was a cached folder labeled Research Materials Hemsworth 2025. Most of the files were password protected, but one, likely missed in haste, was still accessible. He opened it. What loaded on screen made his breath catch. A document heavily formatted, embedded with diagrams and citations. It looked like a formal academic draft. At the top, complex prime distribution within chaotic intervals, a theoretical reconstruction, by Claude Hemsworth. But what stood out wasn't the title, it was the content. Line by line, Elijah saw his own work. His notations, his breakdown of variable relationships, even the unique way he used spacing to group patterns. It was unmistakably his. But there on the top right corner, the date of creation read, 3 days before Elijah presented in class. He checked the metadata. The document had been edited, not created, the same day he was suspended. The timeline didn't just match, it exposed everything. Dr. Hemsworth had downloaded Elijah's file before claiming it was mathematically juvenile. He had studied it, formatted it, then slipped it into his own research archive to establish authorship before any public fallout began. Elijah printed every page, highlighted every pattern. When he showed the findings to Nadine and Monique later that evening, neither of them spoke at first. Nadine ran her hand over her face slowly, like someone bracing for a storm they saw coming, but prayed would never land. "This isn't just theft," she said at last. "This is academic identity fraud. If he succeeds in publishing this, you'll be the ghost of your own work." Monique clutched the printout, her voice shaking. "We're going public." "No," Nadine countered quickly. "Not yet. We need everything. Emails, transcripts, board meeting records. If we release this too early, they'll spin it as paranoia. But if we wait until it's airtight, they can't erase him," Monique finished. For the first time in days, Elijah felt more than anger. He felt dangerous. That night, as he walked into his room, he noticed something wrong. His desk drawer was slightly ajar. He never left it open. With slow hands, he pulled it open fully and froze. His notebook was gone. In its place lay a manila envelope. Inside, a typed letter. "Cease and desist notice. All further dissemination, reproduction, or claim of ownership over mathematical materials submitted within Fairview Academy's academic domain is hereby prohibited. Any continued public reference or affiliation with the disputed solution will be considered a violation of departmental property rights." At the bottom, a signature, "Claude Hemsworth, Ph.D." Elijah dropped the letter to the floor, his jaw clenching in disbelief. They hadn't just deleted his files. They had stolen his past, then mailed him the future, prepackaged in silence. As Elijah stares at the letter, his phone vibrates again, this time with a calendar invite, labeled "Meeting with Fairview Legal Counsel, attendance mandatory." It started with a single leak. Late one evening, Nadine forwarded the internal metadata files, the stolen equation, the timestamp, and the cease and desist letter, to a trusted investigative journalist. Within 12 hours, it was on the front page of The Atlantic. The headline hit like a hammer: "Black Prodigy's Math Solution Erased, Stolen by Prestigious Academy." Subheadings revealed what Fairview tried to hide: screenshots of Elijah's work, the metadata showing Hemsworth's predated file, and a side-by-side analysis that even a layperson could follow. And most damning of all, the final sentence: "If this happened to Elijah Reed, how many others were silenced before him?" The internet didn't scroll past. In less than a day, Elijah Reed's name was no longer just trending, it was exploding. TikToks dubbed him the genius they tried to delete. Twitter hosted threads tracking systemic racism in gifted education. Instagram posts paired photos of Elijah in his hoodie with side-by-side screenshots of the stolen equation. Hashtags ignited like wildfire: "Justice for Elijah," "Let him solve," "Academia is not neutral." Public figures weighed in: celebrities, politicians, mathematicians, activists. Overnight, Elijah became a symbol not just of stolen genius but of every unheard voice buried under red tape and white titles. And while the world lifted him up, Fairview Academy locked itself down. By morning, protesters lined the gates. They carried signs painted in bold red and black: "Stop erasing black minds. Elijah solved it. Admit it. Tenure can't hide theft." A few wore graduation gowns, splashed with chalkboard formulas, symbolic armor in a war they weren't supposed to fight. Students from neighboring schools showed up. So did parents, teachers from other districts. The front lawn, once manicured to perfection, was now a battlefield of conscience. Inside the school, the tone shifted from discomfort to crisis. Emails flew like missiles. Emergency meetings were called. Faculty whispered behind locked doors, arguing over optics and damage control. Hemsworth refused to speak to staff without legal counsel present. His office blinds stayed closed, his door locked. But then he broke his silence, not to the students, not to the media that first uncovered the theft, but on Fox News, in an exclusive sit-down interview. Hemsworth leaned into the frame with the calm arrogance of a man who'd rehearsed every sentence in front of a mirror. "What we're witnessing," he said, "is a coordinated attack on academic freedom. I have spent decades mentoring students of all backgrounds, and now I'm being accused of racism because I dared to challenge a young man's unverified work. This is reverse discrimination. This is political correctness gone mad." The anchor nodded sympathetically. "You're saying you're the victim here?" "I'm saying," Hemsworth replied coolly, "that I was targeted for being a white man in a position of academic authority, and they couldn't handle that." The segment went viral, but not in the way he'd hoped. Within hours, backlash erupted across multiple platforms. Commentators called him delusional, manipulative, a textbook example of gaslighting through privilege. But his interview did something dangerous. It poured gasoline on the fire. Suddenly, Elijah wasn't just a story of brilliance suppressed. He became a target. Hate messages flooded their inbox, racist DMs, threatening emails, comments like, "That kid needs to be put in his place," and "Hope he enjoys his 15 minutes before the system corrects him." One message to Monique simply read, "You'll wish you stayed invisible." Then came the call from her employer. They were reviewing her recent conduct, citing her involvement in unauthorized political activity during company hours. When she asked for specifics, they gave none. Just the promise of a suspension pending investigation. "They're coming after me now," she told Nadine, voice numb. "Not because I did anything, but because I refused to sit quietly while they destroyed my son." At night, their apartment no longer felt like home. It felt like surveillance. They changed passwords, covered their webcams. Elijah stopped opening most of his messages, even the supportive ones, because they all carried weight. Praise that felt like pressure. Admiration that demanded action. He was no longer just a boy solving math. He was now a vessel for a national reckoning. But in the middle of the storm, another email arrived. Anonymous. Short. Menacing. "We don't bomb buildings. We erase them from the inside." They reported it. The school ignored it, until the next morning, when Fairview Academy received a bomb threat. The call came in at 7:42 a.m. A computerized voice, short and monotone. "There's an explosive device in your East Wing. You've made the wrong enemies." Within minutes, the school was evacuated. Police cordoned off the area. Bomb-sniffing dogs, bomb squads, helicopters circling the air like vultures. Elijah watched it all from the apartment window, transfixed by the sight of his school becoming a crime scene. Then the news broke. A leaked internal memo surfaced, a chain of emails between the principal, board members, and external legal advisors. Subject line, "Security review, read connection." In one thread, a board member floated the idea. Could the boy or his supporters be involved? Motivation could be reputational retaliation. No proof, no evidence, just a seed. And in America, a seed of suspicion is often enough. That evening, a news segment ran with the headline, "Terror threat at Fairview. Is there a link to viral math prodigy?" The anchor smiled too much. The story used soft terms like concerns and unconfirmed links, but the implication was loud enough to fracture public perception. Hashtag split. Supporters argued online with skeptics who now called Elijah a danger. Troll accounts accused him of faking genius for attention. Others called Monique an agitator. Their address was posted in a 4chan thread. Police were called again. This time they didn't knock with courtesy. They arrived with suspicion. Nadine stood guard like a soldier. "They will not frame him for this," she told reporters on the sidewalk. "This is the playbook. You humiliate them with truth, and they punish you with narrative. But we see them now." Inside the apartment, Elijah sat silently at the kitchen table, the TV flashing images of helicopters circling his school, while the world debated whether he was a genius or a threat. His notebook was still missing, his name was still under siege, and his childhood was now permanently altered. Then came a knock at the door, firm, official, not police this time. A woman in a federal suit stood with two men in plainclothes behind her. "Mr. Elijah Reed?" she asked calmly. Monique stepped forward. "Who's asking?" "I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. We have questions regarding today's threat." Her tone was polite. Her eyes were not. As they prepare to question Elijah, Monique's phone buzzes. An email from a Fairview administrator marked urgent. Elijah's attendance status has changed. She opens it and gasps. Elijah has been permanently expelled. The woman at the door wore her authority like armor, polished, poised, and heavy with implication. Behind her, two plainclothes agents stood like shadows, eyes scanning the room as if expecting explosives instead of a gifted child. Monique's body stood between them and Elijah, her instincts immediate and maternal. "He's not saying a word without legal counsel," she snapped, voice sharp but steady. The woman nodded once, almost respectfully. "Of course," she said. "You'll want to check your email, Mrs. Reed. There's been a status change." Monique's phone buzzed in her palm. She opened the notification with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the bold red banner at the top of the message. "This letter serves as official confirmation that Elijah Reed's enrollment at Fairview Academy has been permanently terminated, effective immediately. due to security concerns. No hearing, no warning, no appeal. Elijah had been expelled, labeled not just problematic, but dangerous. The school called it a preventative measure. In private, it was exile. In public, it was reputation control. By the time the agents left without arrest, leaving behind a hollow promise of further inquiry, the apartment felt smaller. Monique sat down in silence, the email still open in front of her. They waited until the world was watching, she whispered. And then they shut the door anyway. She filed a federal lawsuit the next day. With the help of a pro bono legal team, Monique's complaint named not only Fairview Academy, but also the Regional Education Board and key faculty, including Hemsworth himself. The claims were clear: systemic discrimination, academic theft, targeted retaliation, and civil rights violations. The paperwork was exhaustive, the evidence airtight, but the system? It moved like quicksand. While the lawsuit crawled through bureaucratic channels, Elijah's future was quietly being rewritten behind closed doors. The elite math camp that had once offered him a scholarship emailed him a single-line update. Due to recent developments and security complications, we are rescinding your placement. No apology, no explanation. Just another door, slammed without a sound. Monique didn't cry. She refused to. Elijah needed clarity, not grief. But behind closed doors, her silence grew heavier. Dr. Walsh stepped in with urgency. "We don't need their approval," she said. "We publish your work independently. Let the world read what they tried to bury." She helped Elijah write and format a clean academic paper, a revised version of his original solution, now annotated and stripped of institutional ties. It was clean, precise, groundbreaking. They submitted it to 5 academic journals, then 10, then 50. Each one responded with variations of the same quiet rejection, not aligned with current research focus, outside of our typical scope, or worse, no feedback at this time. It wasn't the math they were rejecting. It was the boy behind it. Elijah watched it all in silence. The viral attention that once uplifted him had begun to mutate. His face, once a symbol of defiance, now became a lightning rod for division. On TikTok, right-wing creators edited his classroom video over trap music, mocking his expression, questioning his authenticity. "This is what fake genius looks like," one caption read. Another video with over 500,000 views sneered, "This kid solved the same problem I did in 6th grade. Big deal." The comment sections boiled over with dog whistles and denial. They called him a hoax, a plant, a pawn, and behind all the noise, the silence returned. Heavier this time. Elijah, once lit by an inner fire, now sat for hours in a dimly lit room, eyes glazed over, notebook unopened. His mind, once relentless, now slowed. He barely spoke. He barely ate. And one evening, Monique found him sitting at the edge of his bed, the original paper draft crumpled in his hands. "I shouldn't have done any of it," he said quietly. "It only made things worse." Monique knelt beside him. "You did everything right, baby." "They took everything," he whispered. "Even my name." He didn't mean it figuratively. By then, most search results about Elijah Reed led to rumors, accusations, and threats. News coverage had moved on. The internet had grown bored, and the silence that followed was louder than the noise ever was. Then, 3 days later, a letter arrived. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a short message on textured stationery. "Elijah, you have 2 choices. Disappear or speak. Either way, they'll come for you. So choose the path that builds the fire, not the wall." No name, but tucked inside the envelope was a business card, minimalist, black with silver foil. Only 2 words on it: Dr. Kenner Langford. Below it, former Nobel nominee, theoretical mathematics. Nadine's jaw dropped when she saw it. "He disappeared a decade ago after exposing data theft in Ivy League institutions," she said. "He hasn't been seen in public since." Attached was a phone number. They called it. Langford didn't ask for pleasantries. His voice, deep and unshaken, spoke immediately. "I saw what you wrote. I know what you solved. I know what it means. And I know what it cost you." Monique leaned forward. "Why are you reaching out now?" "Because Congress is holding hearings next month on racial disparity in gifted education," he replied. "They're calling experts. But the truth? They need a witness, not an expert. They need someone they tried to erase." A pause. Then he added, "I want Elijah to testify." Elijah hesitates, then asks one question. "If I speak, what do I lose next?" Elijah had never stood behind a microphone so large. The chamber of the House Committee on Education was cavernous, its walls lined with flags and polished wood that radiated authority like heat from a furnace. Cameras dotted every angle, recording every twitch of his jaw, every blink of his eyes, every hesitant breath between sentences. Monique sat in the gallery behind him, clutching a worn notebook that had once been full of equations, now full of questions. The committee members, a mix of representatives in crisp suits and blank expressions, waited for him to speak. He felt as if he were no longer in control of his own words. They belonged to a narrative much bigger than a 12-year-old boy who loved numbers. When Elijah began, his voice was steady but reverberated with the weight of years he never asked to live through. He spoke of Fairview's erasure of his work, of the metadata proof that proved theft, of the cancellations and rejections that followed his honest contribution to mathematics. He didn't speak as a prodigy. He spoke as someone who had been seen, then unseen, then weaponized in the court of public opinion. "I didn't want attention," he said. "I wanted truth." His eyes flicked to Monique and she nodded once, just enough to remind him that he wasn't alone. The room was silent, not respectful, just aware, as the final words left his mouth and the cameras continued rolling. The moment the hearing clip hit social media, it erupted. Millions watched Elijah testify. Some moved, others dismissive, and still others enraged. On the left, commentators praised his courage, framing him as a symbol of systemic injustice. Activists rallied behind him, calling for legislative change, demanding transparency from academic institutions nationwide. On the right, pundits questioned his maturity, suggested he was being manipulated by adults with political motives, and some even called the entire episode a media spectacle, engineered for virtue signaling. The internet was a furnace of praise and vitriol, and Elijah was the blade forged within it. Structural change on the blade's edge, yet still unsharpened for real impact. The political lines carved deep trenches through every conversation. Social media users, who had once cheered Elijah, now argued over whether his testimony advanced equality or exploited it. Senators parroted sound bites about fairness, opportunity, and meritocracy. The hearings continued for hours, but in the end, no policy was passed, no funding redirected, not a single institutional oversight reform was adopted. The gavel fell, and the cameras left. Monique's phone buzzed, endless notifications, some supportive messages, some threats worse than before. They had thought this moment would be vindication. Instead, it felt like a glass ceiling, erected between words and consequences. Elijah left the chamber not with headlines, but with echoes. His voice was now global, but nothing had changed at Fairview. Hamsworth, untouched by scrutiny, emerged not reprimanded, but quietly promoted to assistant dean the very next week, a decision officially attributed to his exemplary leadership, and unofficially whispered among faculty as a reward for defending institutional reputation. When Elijah heard of the promotion, something inside him cracked. He had spoken in the halls of power, yet the man who tried to erase him now wielded more authority than ever. The paradox weighed on Monique like gravity. She found her hope shrinking each day. Nights that once held whispered dreams of relocation now echoed with the question, where could they go, where his mind would not be warped into controversy? Canada? Europe? Somewhere, anywhere, without headlines turning him into a cautionary symbol, instead of a child with a future. Even as political commentators continued to debate, something unseen began to collude behind the shiny veneer of officialdom. Emails between board members surfaced, not leaked by journalists, but accidentally forwarded by an assistant who was unaware of the hidden recipient field planted at the bottom of a draft. In the messages, a line jumped out: "We must contain narrative before it escapes beyond PR control." Another read: "Elijah's testimony was powerful, but it must be framed as political theater, not academic truth." The language choked Monique when she read it. Truth had become a liability, a threat to be tamed. Despite the chaos, Elijah continued his nights in quiet retreat, revisiting equations that had once brought him solace. He wrote fewer words and more numbers, not out of escape, but because numbers never lied. They never turned on you. They were elegant, consistent, trustworthy, unlike the world around him. On a rainy afternoon, Nadine Walsh arrived with a file thick with legal transcripts, committee notes, and press coverage analysis. She looked tired, older than she had in months, but there was a spark in her eyes that reminded Elijah of the first time she explained the logic behind his solution. "They can hear you," she said, but they don't have to listen. That's the cruel loophole in every institution. Power doesn't require understanding. It just requires compliance. Monique nodded slowly, her thoughts turning inward. Maybe we go somewhere else, she murmured, the words raw and unpolished. But they slipped into the room like a plan unfolding. Maybe we start again, without these names, without these headlines. Elijah didn't answer. He stared out the window at the gray sky, as if the future were written in rain clouds, and he was searching for answers in patterns that dissolved upon sight. Weeks passed, and nothing at Fairview changed. The protesters dwindled. The news cycle moved on. The committee wrote platitudes in press releases, but no law was drafted. And then came the twist, a whisper amplified by a leaked audio recording. It began as a low-quality clip on a fringe political forum, but within hours it was everywhere. The recording was from inside Dr. Hemsworth's office, captured by a misplaced microphone, hidden in a potted plant that was meant to mask a malfunctioning security sensor. What was said on that tape was worse than any accusation Elijah had faced. In the recording, Hemsworth spoke with two other faculty members in tones that were casual and unconcerned, like men discussing lunch orders, until the words pierced the ambiance. Let's be clear, Hemsworth said, voice smooth and unguarded. This kid's story is leverage. He's not a threat to knowledge. He's a catalyst for funding. We control the narrative. We keep the power. Another voice chimed in. So we let him speak, but we own the aftermath? Hemsworth chuckled, low and confident. Exactly. We turn him into monument, not momentum. The world applauds him, but here we maintain control. We make sure he never alters anything structural. The implications rippled like a seismic wave. It wasn't just arrogance. It was a conspiracy to commodify Elijah's story, while protecting the existing hierarchy. And it was recorded, undeniable. Within minutes, journalists had the clip on their sites. Social media lit up again. But this time the shock wasn't mixed with praise or denial. It was something deeper. Betrayal. As the public digested the gravity of what had been revealed, one question echoed louder than any other. How deep did this go? The next headline screams not about Elijah's testimony, but about a sealed subpoena compelling Dr. Hemsworth to testify under oath about his admissions on that leaked recording. The clip didn't just spread, it detonated. Within hours of the leaked audio's release, it had surpassed 5 million views on YouTube, shared across every major platform, from academic blogs to pop culture podcasts. Talk shows that had once tiptoed around the controversy now declared it a scandal. It was impossible to misinterpret Hemsworth's voice or dilute the meaning of his words. The quote, sharp, unapologetic, venomous, became the new headline banner across news tickers. If that kid were white, this would have made me a millionaire by now. There was no room for doubt, no context to soften the blow. It was racism, recorded in stereo. Fairview's response came fast, but not noble. At first, the administration released a sterile, 3-line statement. We are aware of the alleged recording. Dr. Hemsworth has been placed on administrative leave pending internal review. It wasn't accountability. It was containment. But containment failed. By morning, the school's gates were surrounded. Again. This time, the student protest was louder, more organized, more relentless. They carried signs quoting Hemsworth's own words back at the institution that protected him. They wore t-shirts that read "Millionaire, if I were white," and chanted, "Reinstate Elijah, remove the rot." Faculty who had stayed silent now broke ranks. An anonymous open letter signed by 47 teachers and staff demanded Fairview not just fire Hemsworth but publicly apologize to Elijah and commit to racial equity audits across all departments. The letter ended with a line that burned its way across social media. We can't teach integrity in our classrooms if we reward theft in our offices. For the first time, Fairview flinched. Monique watched the news from their living room, the TV volume low. Elijah curled beside her like the child he rarely got to be anymore. His eyes were vacant, distant, as if the media frenzy had become background noise in a world that had stolen too much from him already. But as they scrolled through headlines, another notification pinged across her phone. Class action lawsuit filed against Fairview Academy and faculty. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. Former students of color came forward, sharing stories of exclusion, manipulation, silencing, each one a mirror of his own. Their accounts were compiled, legally backed, and brought forth by a civil rights coalition, who saw in Elijah's case the chance to expose a wider infection. Monique exhaled slowly. This was never just about one equation. she murmured. In the midst of it all, offers began pouring in, this time from institutions that had been silent until public opinion gave them permission to care. Historically black colleges and universities reached out, offering Elijah honorary degrees, research fellowships, speaking opportunities. Letters arrived from professors who once taught under Nadine, now heads of departments, eager to align themselves with a name that had become both victim and but Nadine remained cautious. Always one step ahead. She noticed what others missed, a sentence barely audible at the end of the leaked recording. Hemsworth, amid chuckles and strategy talk, had said something else. Stage 2 starts next week anyway. The phrase chilled her more than the racist confession. What did it mean? What was stage 2? She had been in the system long enough to know that corruption never worked alone. It nested, layered, coded beneath bland bureaucracy. That same night she accessed the university's faculty intranet, a place she had long been locked out of, but now had a backdoor into thanks to an anonymous sympathizer from Fairview's IT department. Hours passed as she scoured files and logs, most of it dull administrative content, but then she saw it, tucked inside a buried digital vault, labeled with academic jargon to camouflage its relevance. The folder was named Curriculum Realignment, Longitudinal Studies. Inside it, a single encrypted file with no description, name, Project. Nadine froze. She didn't need a full download to know what it meant. The initials weren't subtle, and the file size was massive, too large for a student's behavioral report or math notes. This was something else, something system level. She copied the file and began the decryption process using old tools from her university days. As the progress bar inched forward, her mind raced. Why would Hemsworth refer to a stage 2 while laughing about profiting off Elijah's silence? Why archive something this massive under a vague educational title unless it hid something? When she finally opened the decrypted version, what she found turned her stomach. It wasn't just about Elijah. It was a full institutional framework, a long-term experimental program designed to track, test, and absorb intellectual property generated by minority students under the guise of educational enrichment. The program detailed data collection strategies, ownership redirection policies, language to use in public-facing documentation, and the most disturbing portion, a risk assessment chart. Next to Elijah's name were 4 columns: cognitive value, compliance probability, containment strategy, media reversal, extraction priority. Phase 1 complete. Nadine's hands trembled over the keyboard. Elijah hadn't just been observed. He had been profiled, measured, and systemically targeted. His genius wasn't an anomaly. It was inventory. The file was proof of an academic conspiracy masked as mentorship, built to convert marginalized brilliance into institutional capital, while starving the originators of recognition. She printed every page, every timestamp, every reference to his name. Then she called Monique. "You need to come see this. Now." Back at the apartment, Elijah sat up as the printouts were laid across the table. Monique scanned the charts in silence, her jaw tightening with each new page. The files referred to other students too, names they didn't recognize, dates going back nearly a decade. "They built a machine," Nadine said. "Not for teaching, for harvesting." Elijah didn't speak. He didn't have to. The truth wasn't new to him, only the scale. Just then, another notification buzzed across Monique's phone. It was from an anonymous email. No text, just an attachment. A redacted list of Fairview faculty involved in the project. One name stood out at the top. Dr. Claude Hemsworth, primary architect, Project. Just as Nadine prepares to send the evidence to the press, her screen freezes, then flashes red. The files begin disappearing before her eyes, remotely wiped, one by one. The screen flashed red like a warning flare in an otherwise silent night. Files that had taken hours to decrypt and minutes to print began vanishing one by one. Before Nadine's eyes, a single blinking line in the corner of the monitor confirmed her suspicion. Remote override initiated. She tried to disconnect the Wi-Fi, even pulled the laptop's battery in desperation, but it was too late. The digital evidence of the project, the pages detailing institutional theft, racial profiling, and intellectual laundering, was being wiped clean in real time, as if someone had been watching the whole time, waiting. But what they didn't know was Nadine Walsh had already printed everything. Stacks of physical copies lay scattered across her dining table. Red ink circled the worst parts. Ownership clauses disguised as mentorship, legal terms like intellectual stewardship and guardian authorship, codes that gave universities license to absorb work from young black and brown minds under the pretense of development. In the world of academia, these weren't just buzzwords, they were weapons. The name Project had a chilling double meaning. Erase and replace. On paper, it sounded like a curriculum initiative. In reality, it was a multi-university conspiracy, cloaked in bureaucracy, protected by tenure, and funded by millions in research grants. Minority students were lured into enrichment programs, given access to resources, and then quietly stripped of authorship through contracts they were too young or under-supported to challenge. Elijah wasn't the first, just the loudest. But now he wasn't just a symbol, he was the smoking gun. Nadine stared at the last sheet still visible on her screen. A list of institutions and named professors, with Hemsworth positioned at the very top. She recognized others, names she once sat beside at conferences, names she once defended. Now she saw them for what they were, architects of silence, designers of a theft so clinical, it passed for scholarship. She didn't hesitate. She sent the documents hard and digital copies to the press, to legal teams, to activists, and to every independent academic journal that still held integrity. Then she sat down in front of her camera, opened a live stream, and told the truth. No filters, no headline, just raw testimony from a black woman they couldn't erase. The Project, she said into the camera, is not just about Elijah. It's about all the brilliance that was buried before it could bloom. It's about every black and brown student who was told they were being nurtured, when really they were being mined. The stream went viral within hours. Universities scrambled. Public relations teams worked overtime. Legal departments issued blanket denials. Some faculty tried to distance themselves, deleting LinkedIn profiles, changing email domains. But the receipts were out. The files were printed. The storm couldn't be stopped. Academic Twitter exploded. Hashtags shifted from Elijah's name to erase and replace and shut it down. Anonymous tip lines were flooded with more stories, more students who'd experienced the same silent robbery. It wasn't just Fairview anymore. It was Yale. It was Stanford. It was smaller liberal arts colleges and big-name tech schools. The theft wasn't idled. It was woven into the very fabric of how academia commodified minority intellect. Praise the idea, bury the name. Monique, meanwhile, sat at the kitchen table, reading line after line of the documents. Her hands shook, not from shock but rage. They wrote him down like inventory, she whispered, like something to be processed. Elijah sat across from her, quiet, distant, his gaze fixed on a single line he couldn't stop rereading. Authorship transfer complete, subject unaware. Those 3 words sank deeper than anything else had. He had always felt it, the way people looked at him as if he was brilliant, but disposable. But seeing it in writing, in policy, it broke something in him that hadn't fully healed since the day Hemsworth erased his work in front of a laughing classroom. That evening, a black car pulled up outside their apartment. A man in a navy suit stepped out. No press badge, no cameras, just a briefcase and a polite knock. When Monique opened the door, he smiled the way men do when they're about to say something rehearsed. "Elijah Reed?" he asked. "I represent a legal partnership acting on behalf of several academic boards and foundations. I'm here to deliver an offer." She didn't invite him in. He didn't mind. Inside the envelope he handed her was a 6-page settlement agreement. The language was careful, legalese polished to perfection. At its core, the offer was this. Elijah would receive a private 7-figure settlement, tax-free, no press releases, no statement. In exchange, he would sign a non-disclosure agreement, never speak about the project again, and legally retract his academic claim over the Riemann-based solution. The wording wasn't aggressive, it was seductive. They weren't buying silence. They were offering relief. "Take the deal," the man said smoothly, "and you walk away protected, respected, quietly remembered, but never targeted again." Monique didn't blink. "What if we say no?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He left the offer on the table and walked back to the car, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. But the silence he left behind was heavy. For hours, Elijah didn't speak. He sat staring at the offer, reading it again and again, the promise of security laced with the price of invisibility. For a boy who never asked for fame, only fairness, the decision wasn't as easy as it seemed. "I could fix our life in one signature," he said finally. Monique looked at him, her voice trembling. "But would it still be yours?" As Elijah folds the settlement letter, a new email appears in Nadine's inbox. This one from a Department of Justice official, requesting a private briefing on the project, with one condition: Elijah must come alone. The email from the Department of Justice sat unopened on Nadine's screen, the subject line pulsing like a live wire: request for private briefing, project, materials. Attached was a single line of instruction: subject must appear alone. It was addressed directly to her, but it was clear who they wanted: Elijah. No cameras, no lawyers, just him in a closed-door room. Monique didn't speak for a long time after reading it. The offer from the legal team, $3 million, full educational sponsorship, lifetime NDAs, was still fresh on the table, its pages curled from her hands, gripping them too tightly the night before. It was a fortune, the kind of number that could erase rent notices, and healthcare debts, and the fatigue that lived in her bones. But at what cost? Elijah, sitting at the other end of the table, didn't ask questions anymore. He just waited for them to decide if his future would belong to numbers or silence. They're offering you a full ride, every top school, every opportunity, Monique said finally, her voice low, and they want the one thing you earned. Without them, your name on that paper. He didn't look up. Then it's not a future. It's a leash. She swallowed hard, torn between the fear of what would happen if he kept speaking, and the shame of imagining a life where he couldn't. That night, they didn't sleep. Neither did Nadine. The weight of the DOJ request, paired with the attempted buyout, had painted a clear picture. Elijah's mind was valuable, but only if it stayed in someone else's frame. To speak was to be dangerous. To stay silent was to be safe, but invisible. It was the same bargain generations before them had faced. Only now, with cameras, hashtags, and donations watching. By morning, Elijah had made his decision. I'm not disappearing, he said quietly, but firmly. I'm building, and he did. 2 days later, Nadine helped him launch the Open Genius Initiative, a free-access digital platform for Black and marginalized students in STEM. No barriers, no gatekeeping, no institutional filters, just access to knowledge, mentorship, and credit. The website's mission was simple: every mind deserves a stage, not a silence. Within 24 hours, the site crashed from overwhelming traffic. Donations poured in. Universities that once ghosted Elijah now sent partnership requests. Private donors, some anonymous, some not, pledged thousands to keep the platform alive. Monique watched it all with awe and worry tangled in equal parts. For the first time, her son wasn't just reacting to a system. He was creating an alternative to it. But visibility breeds risk. As the platform grew, so did the backlash. On conservative news circuits, talking heads called the initiative academic segregation. One host sneered, "So they want safe spaces for kids who couldn't compete with the real system." The dog whistles were no longer subtle. Social media trolls flooded the comment sections of the initiative's launch video, calling Elijah everything from a fraud to a threat. And then it escalated. It wasn't just Elijah they were targeting anymore. It was his little sister, Layla. She was only 9, bright-eyed, curious, and completely untouched by the firestorm her brother had lived through. But that innocence began to fray when she came home from school one day and dropped her backpack at the door like always. Monique bent down to pick it up, about to unzip it to pull out a permission slip from her teacher. Instead, she found a note. No envelope. No sender. Just a plain folded paper, crammed between textbooks. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling as she read the scrawled message. You made your son famous. Let's see what happens when your daughter's the one who disappears. The world seemed to fall out from beneath her feet. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, holding that paper like it was radioactive. Elijah, she said, her voice breaking. He looked up from his laptop, the glow of his website reflecting in his eyes. She handed him the note without a word. His face didn't change right away. Then it did. Slowly, violently. Not in rage but in pain. The kind that doesn't explode, it calcifies. They're coming after her now, he said quietly. Monique nodded, tears welling, her hands shaking. We call the police, she said, already reaching for the phone. But they both knew what would happen. A report would be filed. Maybe a patrol car would do a drive-by. But the threat would linger like smoke after a fire. There were no fingerprints, no camera footage, no clear suspect. Just a reminder that his voice had crossed into dangerous territory again. And now it wasn't just his freedom at risk. It was Layla's safety. Nadine rushed over the moment she heard. Her eyes scanned the note. Then the family. We need to secure everything, she said. Digital protection, home surveillance, school protocols. But how do we protect her from the idea of him? Monique asked. That's what they're trying to kill now. The question lingered longer than any answer could. That night, Layla slept in her mother's bed, unaware of the paper that had threatened her life. Elijah stayed awake, eyes wide in the dark, the glow of his laptop dimmed to black. He opened the settlement offer one last time, read the $3 million figure again. Then slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not out of joy, but defiance. As the sun rises, a new notification hits Nadine's inbox. The Department of Justice has subpoenaed all digital records from Fairview Academy's servers related to the project, and Elijah is being called to testify under federal protection. The moment Elijah's name was listed in the federal subpoena, the machinery of the system shifted. Not the part that sought justice, the part designed to make sure no one like him ever won. It started subtly. Small glitches on the Open Genius Initiative website, delayed page loads, broken donation links. At first Nadine thought it was server stress. Then she checked the backend. The site had been targeted by a coordinated digital assault. IP addresses from multiple countries pinged their servers at once. A classic distributed denial of service (DDoS) attack. But this wasn't just random chaos. It was precise, relentless, and timed perfectly with the DOJ announcement. The attacks escalated. Security logs showed login attempts every 5 seconds. Bot traffic flooded the discussion boards with spam disguised as fake questions, burying real user posts under layers of noise. The message was clear. If they couldn't silence Elijah with money, they'd drown him in disruption. Meanwhile, a wave of anonymous fact-checkers appeared online. Accounts with vague names and cartoon avatars, all suddenly obsessed with discrediting Elijah's academic background. They claimed to have sources inside Fairview. Some produced forged documents suggesting his test scores had been inflated. One viral article, posted on a fringe news site, then picked up by a larger outlet hungry for controversy, alleged that Elijah had cheated during one of his early math competitions. The headline was brutal: "Genius or fraud? New evidence suggests Elijah Reid's rise was manufactured." It wasn't true, but it was effective. For every person who knew better, there were 10 who simply believed what was trending. Monique tried to contact the publications, to demand corrections, but her calls went unanswered, her emails buried in legal deflection. When Nadine confronted a journalist at a press event, the woman just shrugged and said, "Clicks are clicks." Elijah, for his part, withdrew again, but not into silence, into calculation. He spent hours offline, not hiding, but building something. On paper, with pencil, the way he used to before everything burned. The whiteboard in their apartment filled again, this time with something unfamiliar even to Nadine. She watched as he layered equation over equation, symbols she hadn't seen, a structure too abstract to belong to the Riemann problem. It wasn't a solution. It was something new, something harder, something born from pain and clarity. Monique knew that look in her son's eyes. He wasn't angry, he was preparing. Then, like a specter returning to claim stolen ground, Dr. Hemsworth reemerged. It happened during a nationally televised interview on a network that had previously refused to cover the scandal. The anchor leaned in dramatically. "Do you believe the boy Elijah Reid deserves to testify before Congress?" Hemsworth smirked. "I believe in academic integrity, but if we're putting children on pedestals for public entertainment, then perhaps I've misunderstood what education is." The clip went viral. Again, and this time Hemsworth made his next move public. A challenge. He posted it to his professional page, then emailed it to every major outlet. "If Mr. Reid is as brilliant as his followers claim, I welcome a live public discussion on the principles he claims to have discovered. Let's let the world watch and judge for themselves." The bait was obvious. The trap was visible. And yet, Elijah accepted. The event was hosted at a neutral university auditorium, with media credentials flooding in faster than tickets to a championship game. A debate between the disgraced professor and the prodigy he'd tried to erase. Some framed it as a reckoning. Others called it a circus. But the stage was set, cameras lined up, and the world tuned in. Elijah walked into the auditorium, in a plain suit, no logo, no flash, just a single lapel pin, the Open Genius Initiative's minimalist emblem. A key wrapped in flame. Hemsworth arrived late, flanked by 2 legal advisors, his suit sharp, his smirk sharper. The moderator greeted them both, then offered opening remarks about academic discourse and the spirit of respectful disagreement. But the air was thick. This wasn't discourse. It was combat, without weapons, but with reputations sharp enough to cut. Hemsworth began with a polished monologue, reframing everything. I have never questioned young Mr. Reed's enthusiasm, he said. But enthusiasm must be tempered with structure. Genius without context is noise. He gestured to the screen behind him, displaying his own version of Elijah's early solution, subtly altered to misrepresent it. And structure, I fear, is what has been lacking. The audience was split, some nodding, others still, most holding breath. Then it was Elijah's turn. He didn't respond to Hemsworth directly. Instead, he turned to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and began writing. One symbol, then another, then a line, then a full equation, foreign, elegant, impossible to follow at first glance. The symbols spiraled, building upon themselves like musical notation played in silence. Nadine's eyes widened. Hemsworth leaned forward. Elijah turned around. This, he said, voice steady, is something I've been building quietly. It's not based on Riemann. It's not derived from Hemsworth's challenge. It's original. And I'm inviting Dr. Hemsworth, since he questions my authorship, to solve it now. Gasps broke out across the auditorium. Hemsworth froze. The moderator stammered. Dr. Hemsworth, you're not obligated. I'll do it, Hemsworth said quickly, walking to the board. He stared at the equation. His confidence drained in stages. First came confusion, then hesitation, then silence. His marker hovered over the first line. Elijah stepped back, hands folded. The camera zoomed in, and for the first time Hemsworth looked human, fallible, exposed. The room holds its breath as Hemsworth lowers the marker, then turns to the moderator and whispers, "Cut the feed." But the cameras keep rolling. Elijah stood under the harsh lights of the auditorium stage, the equation he'd written still glowing on the massive screen behind him. It wasn't just symbols and variables, it was the crescendo of every moment he'd lived through, every slight he'd endured, every hidden agenda that had tried to bury him. The air was thick enough to taste, electric with anticipation. The world was watching, not just the cameras in the room, but millions of live stream viewers across continents, glued to screens, because this wasn't just academic theater, it was a reckoning. Hemsworth lingered at the whiteboard, marker in hand, but his confidence was gone. The smirk he once wore like armor had slipped, replaced by a tension that made his jaw tighten with each passing second. He stared at the symbols, his eyes darting from one unfamiliar group of variables to another. Sweat beaded along his temple, not from exertion, but something more primal: fear of exposure, fear of obsolescence, fear of being unmasked, before an audience that had already seen his arrogance in full display. The moderator, sensing the discomfort radiating off Hemsworth like heat from an oven, cleared his throat and reminded the audience of the rules. But no one was listening. The silence was already wrapped, a vacuum that sucked all hesitation out of the room. What was about to unfold wasn't a debate, it was a demonstration, and the world was on the edge of its seat, waiting. Suddenly, Hemsworth reached for his laptop, an action so unplanned it sent a ripple through the crowd. Phones lifted, cameras zoomed, reporters leaned in. He opened a browser, fingers hesitating over the keys before typing something into Google. How to solve nested complex prime function. The irony was seismic. A man who had declared an equation unsolvable, a man who had scoffed at brilliance he couldn't contain, was now asking a search engine for answers. A collective gasp rose among the audience. Not mockery, but disbelief. This was a moment of truth, raw and unfiltered. The algorithm suggestions popped up. Links to blogs, student forums, basic math help sites, all more suited for beginners than the monumental challenge at hand. Hemsworth's breath hitched, and he glanced toward Elijah as if looking for rescue. But Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to. Stepping forward, voice calm yet resonant, Elijah addressed the crowd. This equation isn't about complexity for its own sake. It's about seeing patterns others overlook, because they're too busy clinging to what they think genius looks like. His explanation began not with jargon, but with logic, the pure, simple thought that mathematics is a language, and every language responds to structure and intent. He traced each line, each symbol, weaving them together with a clarity that made onlookers hold their breath. It wasn't condescension, it was revelation. In real time, layer by layer, he pulled back the curtain on the final equation, the one no one else had seen before. The auditorium, once divided by skepticism and anticipation, now bowed to awe. Students leaned forward, teachers dropped their notebooks, and journalists set aside prepared questions. Everyone watched as a young black mathematician dismantled centuries of held assumptions, not with arrogance, but with clarity and purpose. The solution unfolded like a symphony, elegant, bold, undeniable. Behind him, Hemsworth sat slumped in his chair, the weight of his own silence heavier than any public humiliation he'd ever faced. His name had once carried academic weight. Now it carried the crushing realization that a child, no, a young man, had outgrown the limits he'd tried to impose. When Elijah pronounced the final result, a wave of astonishment rippled through the auditorium. For a moment, the world outside felt distant, like a held breath waiting for release. Then came the applause. It began quietly, tentative, as if people were unsure whether they were allowed to celebrate. But soon it swelled. Not the polite clapping you hear at award shows, something deeper, something raw and unfiltered, like a collective exhale from minds that had been waiting their whole lives for validation. The cameras didn't cut away. The live stream didn't freeze. Networks that once ignored his story were now broadcasting the moment live. Replays in slow motion, analyst panels dissecting the significance, emails pinged through the Open Genius Initiative server, offering partnerships, scholarships, professorships, universities across the country, institutions that had once distanced themselves, now issued formal apologies. Their statements were polished, heartfelt, careful. Many quoted his name, with reverence followed by regret. But Elijah didn't want titles. He didn't want honorary chairs, or endless invitations to panels he already knew were performative. He wanted change. After the auditorium lights dimmed, and the world continued to buzz with praise and astonishment, Elijah stepped off the stage, and found Monique waiting in the wings. Her eyes were radiant with pride, but her expression was tempered by concern. The cost of brilliance was still very much alive in her heart. She didn't need to ask what was next. He already knew. "We make it count," he said softly, his voice steady. She nodded, and so they took the moment from spectacle to policy. Within days, a senator known for vocal support of educational reform reached out, not for applause, not for photo ops, but with legislative intent. He praised Elijah's achievement publicly, but more importantly, he drafted a bill that would reform how intellectual property generated by students, particularly from marginalized backgrounds, was recognized and protected in academic settings. The language of the bill was transformative. Credit where credit was due, transparency and mentorship agreements, protections against predatory appropriation of youth scholarship. The senator called it the Reed Equity and Academic Recognition Act. When Elijah heard the name, his breath caught. Not because it bore his name, he wasn't one for grandeur, but because it meant the fight was extending beyond headlines and applause. It meant systemic change. It meant that one boy's stolen brilliance could transform the destiny of many. But as the bill gained momentum, as press conferences echoed with support, an unexpected twist emerged. An investigative journalist contacted Nodine with a heavily redacted document labeled Precedent Evaluation, Student Intellectual Rights, Confidential Review. Inside, she found references to similar cases dating back decades, cases that were never publicly acknowledged, quietly settled or buried entirely. Names, dates, schools, universities, all different, all with a common thread. Minority students whose intellectual work had been claimed by others, their achievements rebranded under faculty names. The scale was enormous, and it wasn't incidental. It was systemic. As Nadine stared at the redacted pages, the true weight of Elijah's victory, and the mountains still ahead, began to take shape. Just as the Reed Act is formally introduced to the Senate floor, an anonymous envelope arrives at Elijah's door. Inside, a single USB drive, labeled simply Phase 3. Years after the world first learned his name, Elijah Reed stood in a sunlit lecture hall at a historically black university in Atlanta, watching a group of young students work through complex problems on tablet screens and whiteboards. His hair was longer now, streaks of silver woven into the black curls that once symbolized his youth. His voice, the same voice that once trembled with doubt under the weight of institutional erasure, now carried calm authority. These weren't just students, they were seekers, minds once told they were too young, too underserved, too inexperienced to matter. Elijah had become more than a symbol. He had become a mentor, a guide, a living testament to what happens when brilliance meets opportunity instead of concealment. The room buzzed with energy, not the frantic chaos of competition, but the thoughtful hum of exploration. A young girl, no older than 12, leaned over her notes, puzzled by a proof that had stumped her for days. Elijah approached slowly, kneeled beside her desk, and asked a simple question. "What does the equation want to tell you?" She blinked, startled by the phrasing. Most teachers asked what it meant. Elijah asked why it existed. That nuance changed everything in her eyes. She smiled. the fog lifting in a shift so subtle it felt like dawn breaking. It was a glimpse of what Elijah lived for now, unlocking potential instead of defending it. The world beyond the lecture hall had long since changed. The Elijah Reed Education Equity Act had passed after years of struggle, amendments, courtroom battles, and headline storms. The law reshaped gifted programs across the nation, requiring transparency in admissions, equitable access to advanced coursework, and protections for intellectual property generated by minors. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't silence every voice that had been stifled, but it was a structural shift no one could undo with a memo or a PR statement. School districts that once hid behind eligibility now had to prove they weren't hiding bias. Fairview Academy, the institution that once expelled him under the guise of security protocols, underwent its own transformation. Gradually, pressure from alumni, activists, and truth-bearing journalists forced the school to confront its legacy. The statues of old benefactors, white men in stiff collars, were taken down. Portraits of students of every shade, past and present, went up. The academy was renamed the Reed Institute for Inclusive Scholarship. The board invited Elijah to speak at the inauguration ceremony, but he declined. Not because he didn't care, he did, but because the moment belonged to the students standing around him now, voices raised in celebration of possibility rather than erasure. Dr. Claude Hemsworth, once perched atop academic hierarchy, had retired in disgrace. His promotions had evaporated faster than his denials. Invitations to speak at conferences dried up. Universities quietly removed his authored papers from their syllabi. Academic journals published editorial after editorial on ethical gatekeeping and on how one man's racist dismissal had catalyzed nationwide reform. Hemsworth retreated to anonymity, a name mentioned now only in historical context or as a cautionary tale. He had spent decades building walls around knowledge. In the end, those walls became exhibits in ethics classes he would never teach. Hollywood took notice too. Elijah's story, the boy who was mocked, erased, hunted by misinformation campaigns, nearly bought into silence, and ultimately vindicated through genius and perseverance, became a feature film. The casting was meticulous. The script, nominated for awards, wove archival footage with reenactments that captured not only the events, but the emotional landscape behind them. The opening night screening was hosted at a Black-owned historical theater in downtown Chicago. Monique sat in the audience, teary yet steady, watching her son's journey unfold on the screen in a way that was both personal and universal. Families filled the seats, children holding their parents' hands, students in gifted programs, seeing themselves reflected in Elijah's arc, teachers applauding a truth long overdue acknowledgement. After the film, Elijah walked the red carpet, not as a celebrity, but as a witness. People lined up to speak to him, some with gratitude, others with stories of their own erased brilliance, all with the same question: what's next? His answer was always the same: grow the initiative, pass the torch, make room for millions more. And he did. The Open Genius Initiative blossomed into a nationwide network of community labs, mentorship programs, and digital archives where students of color could publish, collaborate, and share breakthroughs without fear of appropriation. Universities no longer treated student work as property to be buried or repackaged. Instead, they built platforms for co-authorship, ensuring the voices behind the ideas remained front and center. Scholars once overlooked were now cited, celebrated, and funded. Still, Elijah carried one burden he refused to lay down: the unfinished equation. Late nights found him bent over his desk, the table strewn with index cards, notebooks, and chalk-smudged pages, filled with symbols only a handful of minds on Earth could decipher. It wasn't arrogance that fueled him. It was curiosity, the same force that first drew him to math as a child. His days were dedicated to uplifting others, but his nights belonged to that one tantalizing problem, a frontier beyond the Riemann variations that had made him famous. It was personal, but also universal, a challenge that spoke to the edges of what human logic could reach. One afternoon, Elijah invited a group of senior initiative scholars into his home study, a sunlit room lined with books, framed equations, and photographs of students whose names once went unspoken. At the center was a chalkboard white as fresh snow, covered with fresh attempts at patterns no one had cracked yet. The group buzzed with ideas, each voice bringing perspective, each mind meshing with another. Elijah watched them with the same admiration he'd felt when he first saw those numbers align in his own notebook years ago. This was the future he'd fought for, collective brilliant minds shaping the frontier. But even in triumph, shadows lingered. One evening, as Elijah stepped off a Zoom call with educators in Nairobi, discussing equitable curriculum development. His phone buzzed with an unfamiliar notification. New message from unknown sender. The preview read only one sentence. I see you've been teaching them well. But have you prepared them for what comes after? Below that was an attachment named Read Unsolvable Archive. Elijah's breath caught. He had assumed the unfinished equation was his alone. A private mountain he climbed, not for acclaim, but for the pure pursuit of truth. Now, someone else knew of it. Someone outside the initiative. Someone with access to archives they should never have reached. He opened the file. The first page was his own handwriting, but this wasn't his work. The symbols were familiar, yet arranged in a way he hadn't conceived. An extension, a twist, something deeper, more complex. It was as if someone had taken his unfinished equation and evolved it further and named it. At the bottom of the document, in a distinctive scrawl he recognized instantly, was a name, Dr. Nadine Walsh. Elijah stared at the screen, heart thudding with disbelief and dread. Nadine had always been his fiercest ally, the one who saw him when no one else did, the one who fought when others fled. But her name here on a version of his equation he never wrote suggested something far more complicated. Before he could process it, another message popped up. Phase Omega, ready for review. No explanation, no context, just those 3 words. Elijah scrolled down to the next page and gasped. Because there, in the margin of the encrypted document, was a notation he never taught anyone to write, and a symbol that matched an equation once dismissed as myth. If you believe brilliance should never be silenced because of skin color type, yes in the comments. What would you have done if your child was erased? Not because they were wrong, but because they were black. Subscribe for more true stories that expose what too many still try to hide. Because the fight for justice doesn't end, it evolves.